Jamie Peck, hello, welcome to Paris and welcome to the French Geographical Society. And firstly, we want to congratulate you for your Vautrin-Lud prize. So, Jamie Peck and Professor Jamie Peck, can you introduce a little bit about yourself?
I was born in England in a coal mining region of Nottinghamshire. Went to university at Manchester, and I think that was probably the formative experience of my early life, was to spend time in a deindustrializing city, one struggling with economic decline and social political challenges. This was also a period where national politics in Britain turned to the right under Margaret Thatcher, and so the British cities at that time were in a relationship of more or less direct conflict with central government. Most of the cities being controlled by the Labour Party, but the national government in control of the Conservative Party. So this was a period where there was geography had a clear relevance there, and the kind of politics that were being produced at the grassroots in cities, especially those confronting the challenges of deindustrialization, seemed a long way away from the priorities of the Thatcher government, which were focused on developing the financial industries, connecting London with international circuits of growth and so on. Such that in many respects other parts of the country became more distant economically and socially from the capital during that period. So I spent most of the 1980s in Manchester. After finishing my undergraduate degree, became a doctoral student entirely by accident rather than planning. I had no job to go to after my degree. The economy was in a poor state, and my former tutor at the university said there was an opening for a PhD student, and if I wanted it, I should tell him the next day. So I thought all of 24 hours about becoming a graduate student in geography. And having taken that step, the 1980s were not a particularly positive period for academic geography in the UK. Most of the universities were not hiring people during that time. So to be a PhD student was a rather a curious choice. It reflected a lack of options to a certain degree. I think my primary goal was to probably find a job in local government or perhaps working for a labour union. But one thing led to another, and at the end of my PhD I was able to win a postdoctoral fellowship at Melbourne University in Australia, and at that time felt I was really starting to belong in the discipline of geography, having been somewhat semi-detached to it through the 1980s, and was able to obtain an academic job. My first teaching job was back in Manchester a few years later, and so I joined Manchester University as a lecturer in 1989. And that was the time, of course, which was dominated by European integration and really a different way of thinking about the positionality of the UK and of deindustrialised cities like Manchester, which began to think of themselves as European cities and imagine their position within European funding programmes and so on. So I started teaching at the time when I suppose the global consciousness around that city was changing quite rapidly. After a few years teaching in Manchester, my first sabbatical leave I took in the United States and went to Baltimore to the department of David Harvey and Erika Schoenberger, and spent a year in the United States studying the process of welfare reform. The US at that point was on the cusp of a really transformative shift away from the principles of the New Deal established in the 1930s, where welfare was an entitlement of the poorest in the country, and that was on the brink of abolition effectively in 1995-6 when I spent the year there. I found working in the United States extremely challenging and provocative. It seemed to me that there were lots of questions both for geographers and those with a critical orientation to the activities of the state, which in a curious way is a blind spot of American social science, which seems to partly believe the mythology of the United States having a small government that doesn't take a large part in society. I think as Europeans, we're accustomed to looking at the role of government and tracking its every move and developing critiques of new policies and so on. That culture is less developed in the United States. It seemed therefore to be an exciting place to work for a geographer with an interest in the way in which the state and policy was being transformed, especially in that truly systemic historical way through the process of welfare reform. So after spending a year travelling around the States, interviewing many policymakers and activists and academics across the country, I think decided at that point to see if I could make my career in the US system. And a few years later moved to Wisconsin and spent 8 years based at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. We moved there with 2 small children who effectively grew up as American kids, and we had a great time living in that city, and it was wonderful to work in a great university like the University of Wisconsin, and especially to work with some prominent sociologists like Eric Olin Wright and Gay Seidman, people whose work I'd been influenced by before. And at that point, worked both as a geographer and a sociologist. And so I got a more developed sense, I think, about what the relative strengths and weaknesses of geography are relative to sociology. I found that the sociology program at Wisconsin was incredibly high performing. Its graduate students specialized early and deeply, whereas in geography we encourage more of a generalist outlook. In many respects we're magpies, borrowing from here and there. We can be very eclectic in our theoretical orientation and our methodologies. And I think during that period I learned the value of both of those approaches, both for the specialists in sociology who stay with issues and focus quite narrowly quite early on, and the geographers who work across a broader canvas and with a more open canon, a more exploratory ethos. I think that one of the issues for geographers is we can often be rather forgetful of our own traditions and the past lessons in the field, which are observed more directly in these fields like sociology. So that was a very important period for me, I think, to develop new interests, to refocus a lot of my work in Chicago especially. I worked with a collaborator there, Nick Theodore, on a number of projects on urban poverty and labour markets in Chicago, and continued to work on welfare and those issues for a number of years as well. In 2008 I moved to my current position at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada, initially to a research chair there. And since that time, I think I've been gradually reorienting my interests to focus across the Pacific. It seemed, being in Vancouver, I was a long way from Europe. I was even a long way from the east coast of the United States in flight time. Doing field work there was increasingly challenging. And so in the course of the last decade or so, my interests have moved increasingly towards Asia, started to work on Hong Kong and China during this time. So I think I've had a career largely in the Anglophone world, but moving between a number of different systems. I think I've learned to appreciate the particular strengths of a North American university system, especially for the training of graduate students, which is in many respects the most rewarding and engaging aspect of positions there. So I've enjoyed being able to work with a large group of extremely talented doctoral students over the past 20 years or so that I've been in North America, and I think they've shaped my own work in lots of ways. So I think one thing to emphasize out of this is I think that a lot of our work in the social sciences and in geography perhaps particularly is collaborative, both working with students and with colleagues in different parts of the world. And so I've continuously benefited from collaborative relations, which I've been able to maintain over the long time period in many respects. I give the advice to my students that it's always good to collaborate, and better to collaborate with somebody smarter than you, from whom you can learn many lessons. You can improve your writing, you can stretch your worldview and see the world from different kind of perspectives. So I think I've benefited enormously from those opportunities.
So I'm really, really impressed when you explain both your life and your career from Nottinghamshire to Manchester, from Manchester to Australia, from Australia to Wisconsin, etc., etc. But when I ask you to introduce yourself, first you talked about Nottinghamshire, and then you explained about the political, sociological, even economical situation of the city, and I guess the region. So we can say, maybe we'll disagree, but we can say that you're a global citizen, a global geographer, or a global researcher, let's say. But in the same time, did your geographical background, let's say, influence your work, or even influence your way of considering the world, considering the world transformations, and maybe the way you practice and you do geography?
I think it does for all of us, often in ways that are difficult to specify or codify. Of course, we live these relations rather than necessarily analysing them. I would say, as I'm from a family that I was one of the first generations to go to university. There was not a history of that in my own family. So going to Manchester and entering the university system was something that I think I was only partly prepared for. I don't think I was necessarily socialised for that future in the school system. Most of my friends from Nottingham that I grew up with left school at 16, entered jobs in manufacturing and construction and so on, and stayed in that community. And that community has been one of the most stable for many years, based on coal mining, railways, those industries. It feels a long way away from me now, after all of these successive moves. I'm not entirely sure how much of that imprint remains. I still think I hold the accent that I grew up with from that community, which means that I don't speak like a presenter on the BBC or a member of the royal family, but with a distinctive regional accent. And a joke that I sometimes shared with my students when I moved to the United States was that when I taught in England, the presumption was that I was less intelligent perhaps than I am, by virtue of the accent I'm possessing, a regional accent. But when I moved to the United States, to speak with an English accent is something of a distinction. And students in the United States thought I'm actually more intelligent than I actually am, courtesy of my exotic accent. So I guess that aspect of my upbringing continues to travel with me. I think the other thing to say is that in retrospect, I realised that I came of age during a period of amazing transformation in British economic and social life. At the end of the post-war pattern of economic and social development, the beginning of deindustrialization, the arrival of neoliberalism, as we would later call it, the increased financialization of the economy and so on. And I'd grown up in a full employment community which had been largely stable and was about to enter a period of significant dislocation. Most of the coal mines closed down, even though the miners from Nottinghamshire were the ones that broke the strike, the famous miners' strike of 1984-85, which was perhaps the most significant confrontation during the Thatcher years, and the eventual defeat of the coal mining union was in many respects an historical turning point for the country. And I don't think we can necessarily appreciate these more systemic movements in history when we are living them in real time. But in retrospect, it feels like I grew up in a somewhat different world to the one that I started to live in as an adult and as a geographer. Started to work in Manchester and then moving overseas. So I think my work ever since has been tuned into these questions of transformation, and especially the ways in which historical and geographical change tend to be jointly constituted. And it remains extremely important from which geographical vantage point we witness and try to understand those transformations. It was formative for me, I think, that my early reading of Thatcherism and neoliberalism was constructed from a position in the north of the country, in many respects on the receiving end or in the struggles against that political project. And it's also, I think, significant that as geographers we work on these issues in a very grounded way in connection with local communities and interviewing local business people, government leaders, community leaders and so on. And so we tend to have a rather grounded reading even of these epochal, broadly historical changes. We'll often encounter them through the local before we think about them as more generalized, perhaps universal, but there are a few of those changes that prove to be universal, but more systemic or structural changes. So I think that sense of seeing transformative change, if you like, from below and from the local scale as something that has stayed with me throughout my career, and remains a hallmark of a lot of the work of human geographers, I would say, around the world. This sensitivity to the importance of place, but also recognizing that each place is positioned differently in the world, and each place also provides a distinctive vantage point or perspective on the transformations in the world, economically, politically, socially, and so on. So that sense of being located in our analyses and our interpretations of transformative change, I think, is a product of that background.
You mentioned before, in your introduction, you mentioned David Harvey, which is one of the maybe the most famous geographers belonging to what had been called radical geography. Mm-hmm. And when we read your articles, your papers, etc., there are a lot of researchers who can be classified as radical geographers. I will ask you two questions within one question. First, do you consider yourself as a representative or a radical geographer? So if yes, all right, and if not, or if the answer is much more complicated than just a yes or a no, how has the radical geography school influenced your work and your way of doing geography?
Mm-hmm. I would describe myself, I think, as a radical geographer, although I don't think that is a singular identity. My work has largely been positioned, I would say, in between the projects of David Harvey on the one side and Doreen Massey on the other. I consider that their scholarly programs to be addressing different sides of the same problem in many respects. Harvey with his concerns that are more abstract, his analysis of the transformation of capitalism is rooted in a sharp reading of the original Marxian texts, especially Capital Volume 1, but Marx's works more generally, is in many respects are theories of capital and transformations of capital. Whereas the Massey approach is itself in dialogue with different forms of Marxism, but also embraces, I think, a wider and somewhat more grounded analysis, taking account of the intersections between class relations, gender relations, local politics, and so on. So Massey's is a more granular, in some respects contingent, grounded analysis. And at various points, her project was in conflict with Harvey's. They, for various times in their careers, were in dispute with one another. But I'd see their contributions each to be vital and each addressing different sides of those questions of social and political and economic transformation. My own work, I would say, is rather more institutionalist than either of their projects. Harvey has never spent a great deal of time focused on the structure and transformation of the state, for example. Massey's own work involved working inside of the state. She was heavily involved with the Greater London Council's projects, for example, in the early 2000s. Although institutional analysis as such was not necessarily part of her own project. So I think my own line of work has been more institutionalist in the broadest sense of that term, and so somewhat, I would say, complementary with their projects, but also distinct from them. One of the earliest influences on me was the work of the Hungarian historian and anthropologist Karl Polanyi. Polanyi is a rather idiosyncratic thinker in many respects, hard to classify in the social sciences, didn't really ever hold a stable academic position, was also multiple times a refugee and displaced from one part of the world to another. And I think Polanyi had his most famous book, The Great Transformation, gives away the most significant aspect of his argument. His was a life lived through historical transformations, of which he had an especially acute reading as a really deep institutionalist thinker. And so Polanyi's version of critical economics, institutionalist analysis, was really influential for me from the point of being a graduate student onwards. And I would say my work's also been in dialogue with that Polanyi tradition, which is somewhat more anthropological and sociological, again, than the Harvey Massey traditions.
In your recent book, published, I guess, in 2023, called Variated Economies, you focus on the transformation of capitalism and capitalist structure. And basically my question will be, is capitalism the only economic model nowadays in the world? First, are there other types? Maybe North Korea, we all the time talk about North Korea or the counterpart. And even if it's the only one, I mean, if capitalism is the only economic system, is there just one form of capitalism or different capitalisms with an S, let's say?
Well, I'd again take some of my cues from Karl Polanyi on this question. Polanyi insisted that every economic system in human history is a hybrid system, comprising different elements in a range of combinations. So, for example, markets existed before capitalism, been incorporated into capitalism in particular ways, but a market system cannot exist on its own. In its own way, it is codependent on the household system, the system of social reproduction, and various forms of redistribution and state policy and such like. So Polanyi's analysis is that all economies are hybrid. There is no teleological dominant trend in history towards or away from one of those. It's not like that we're moving towards a completely marketized, that would be an impossibility, society or culture. Even if we might say that the weight of the market has become especially oppressive and dominant in the course of the last 30 or 40 years, its balance with other modes of economic organisation has certainly shifted. So Polanyi provides a vocabulary for thinking about economies in the plural in a complex, differentiated state, and invites us to consider the different forms of combination and coexistence that exist in all human economies. And so in that respect, capitalism can't be a system that exists entirely on its own. It can't entirely monopolize the space of the economic. And we can find difference both within capitalism and beyond it. And in many respects, the project of figuring out the geographical structure of capitalist systems has been a central one in my own work, as it has been for David Harvey, Doreen Massey, and many other economic geographers in the past 30 or 40 years. Harvey tends to take the view that the analysis should begin with the internal dynamics, contradictions, and laws of motion of the capitalist system itself. Massey's view, as I mentioned earlier, tends to be a more encompassing one that sees capitalism operating in its different social contexts and institutional contexts. And I think that would be somewhat more compatible with Polanyi's analysis as well, and the one that I would emphasise. I would also say, however, that where geography still has work to do is in its understanding of this systematic spatiality of economic systems, including capitalism. So we can pluralize capitalism in a rather casual way. There are literatures in the social sciences that, under the rubric of comparative capitalism and varieties of capitalism, most of them have a very anemic and denuded geography. Many of them boil down to comparisons between the United States and its mirror image, whatever seems appropriate at the time. So the varieties of capitalism literature, when it grew up in the 1990s, tended to draw especially sharp distinctions between the United States and Europe, and its ideal types of capitalism essentially reflected the German economy and the American economy in idealized form. In the past 10 or 15 years, the polarity has shifted towards comparisons between the United States and China. In both cases, I would say that tendency to polarize and to focus on a single dimension of difference is far too reductive. Most geographers would reject that simplified view almost automatically. And we have a default position in many ways that the world is far more complex than most simplifying theories, but at one level that's also a rather banal observation. I think it becomes incumbent upon us to figure out, well, if capitalism isn't simply a bipolar system separated between a US model and a Chinese model, or a US model and a European model, by what other geographical criteria might we organise our understandings of capitalism? I think that those questions remain very much open. And geographers tend to be rather sceptical of fixed categorical analyses to those questions. I think most of our approaches tend to exceed simplifying categories. We burst out of the boundaries of delimited models, for example. And so I think a more process-based understanding of the spatiality of capitalism is the line that many of us are likely to pursue. But as I've said, I think there's still a great deal of work still to do on that front. I think we tend to embrace analyses that are saturated in complexity and multipolarity without necessarily being able to crystallize strong conclusions from those analyses. So I think there's probably more we can do there, and perhaps different kinds of relationships that we can construct with the other social sciences that are engaged with these questions, many of which are intrigued by the insights of geographers more than they are necessarily persuaded by them. So.
Since the beginning of our interviews, you deeply focused on economic factors. You talked about economy, but I mean, when I try to understand what you mean from a European perspective, it seems sometimes when I read the European geography, let's say, that the economic factors are less considered than other factors, other methodology, maybe we can say, focusing more on climate issues or focusing more on, I don't know, for example, gender issues or more social issues, environmental issues. Do we see right now a transformation, a paradigmatical transformation because of the period, the contemporary period? Or do you think that, again, we can make an hybridization between this radical, I mean, I don't like this term, but let's say traditional radical geography perspective, and these new perspectives, which are also new things, actually, in our contemporary societies?
Well, when I suppose became a geographer in the 1980s, the language that encased my part of the discipline was about industrial geography. So this broadening of industrial to economic geography was, I think, the first move to recognise the diversity of economic life beyond that industrial focus. But it was also part of a transformation in the field itself to consider the economy less as a separate sphere, isolated from the cultural, the political, the ecological, the institutional, and instead to have a much more enriched, or sometimes called an integral understanding of the economy. Again, in Polanyi's terms, all economies are embedded in society. The economy is not a self-acting system with its own logic that operates separate from society, culture, politics and the state and so forth, but is inescapably embedded and co-produced with that social context. So I think that sense of a broader view of the economic and an unbounded understanding of the economic gained a strong foothold in the 1990s. And since that time, in economic geography, I would say, certainly in the Anglophone world, there's been a strong sense that the field should not be narrowly focused on certainly the capital E style of economics or the economy in a traditional narrow definition. But in many respects the field is at its most dynamic in its boundary conversations with other intellectual communities and if you like, at the boundaries of the economic. And so we could think about the relationship between economic geography and feminist geography, or economic geography and political ecology, economic geography and cultural studies, economic geography and the state and studies of governance. All of those have been extremely dynamic. In fact, arguably some of the most dynamic in the field of economic geography, which in many respects I run convene a summer institute for economic geographers, which has been meeting for 20 years. And one of the recurring themes in those meetings is that economic geography is now a donut-shaped field. That is, it does not have a recognisable core. In fact, one of the few things that economic geographers agree on is there is no core. There's no centre to which we all adhere. It's become a field that is dynamised by its relationships with other projects and which constantly stretches and rethinks and reworks the economic. So it's slightly ironic in some respects that this critique of economism is so strongly rooted in a field that still calls itself economic geography, where the narrow focus on the economy, I think, has largely been eclipsed by more all-encompassing forms of analysis. But again, the challenge is, how do we do this in a way which isn't simply proliferative and splinters into 1,000 different pieces? How do we maintain a culture of intellectual communication and reproduction of research communities in such a context of diversity? So I think that's one of the things that the field has been working on rather actively, how to maintain cultures of scholarly communication, research programs, theoretical debates and so on across this much more differentiated terrain, especially when the field isn't especially large compared to sociology or economics. The number of people practicing economic geography is relatively small. So we have a big, diverse and complex world and a relatively small workforce, if you like, of economic geographers. But I think this mandate to explore the boundary conversations of the field has been extremely liberating for the field. It's created an enormous innovation and sustains a culture of creativity, which means that it rarely becomes repetitive, rarely becomes dull or boring, but is constantly reinventing itself in a dynamic fashion. So I think that that means that we have this sense of the economic in a rather expansive way, that we would never treat it as an isolated sphere, but would insist on its significance amongst other factors that are to be considered.
And my last question will be more prospective, let's say. Some scholars argue that capitalism had never been so strong. Other scholars, on the opposite, argue that capitalism is collapsing. You, Professor Jamie Peck, how do you see the world of tomorrow?
I've never subscribed to a view of economics or social science which is predictive. Although I've always been tuned into the questions of transformation, and in many respects, I think the tools of geography have been especially well used in the analysis of real-time change. I think economic geography as a field works in what I would call restructuring time. It works on the process of transformation as it occurs in the moment with the actors that are involved in it, and the field has become very adept at analysing economies in motion. And so that raises one of the questions about where we want to go today to study the most advanced or path-breaking or frontier forms of capitalism, or indeed alternatives to that. This is one of the reasons that I find myself working now in China, which I would characterize as the location of the San Andreas fault of the global capitalist system. In many respects runs through the region close to China, especially between China and Hong Kong, where my recent project has been focused. There you see a clash and an interaction between, if you like, a Western model of relatively free market financialized capitalism, which has been idealized for many years in Hong Kong, and a type of economy which in many respects lacks a name, that operates on mainland China. Officially, in the language of the Chinese Communist Party, is the socialist market economy. It is officially not recognized as capitalist. But I think the question of whether China is capitalist or not is in many respects too blunt a question. The question should be about what forms of capitalism are emerging and perhaps reaching their own forms of crisis in China and in the greater China zone at the present moment. I think we're in a period of great historical uncertainty, where the clash between what is sometimes called the state capitalism of China and the more liberal capitalisms of the West is being portrayed politically and ideologically as a sort of a Cold War struggle between completely separate systems. In fact, those two systems are intricately connected with one another, in many respects co-produced. The Chinese economy's most dynamic market-facing regions are in many ways servicing Western markets. Western multinational capital is present in many parts of China. So these are not exclusively separate domains by any means. So the question about where the future of capitalism might lie, I think is in many respects being lived out in real time in those kinds of border regions like that between Hong Kong and the Pearl River Delta in China, where we see these alternate systems almost like tectonic plates grinding against one another, producing instability and earthquakes, as we saw in Hong Kong in 2019 with the extended series of street protests there. I think the future of that region and of capitalism more generally is truly unknowable. It's being made socially and politically by the actors on the ground and elsewhere. So I think the future is always socially produced and is never predetermined or preordained. And it's going to be especially shaped by these, I think, key struggles. In some respects, at the margins or the cusp of what is officially recognised as capitalism. So that nomenclature about capitalism is probably too blunt to really be able to address these questions of geographical, social, political interaction, which I think demand the kind of analysis that geographers have developed. And I think there's some interesting work for us to do to work on these fracture zones, spaces of crises, spaces in which also new economic forms are being produced. Many of them perhaps that don't have names at the present time, that our categories of analysis are in many respects lagging the speed of transformation of economy and society itself. So I've always advocated that we should constantly place our categories of analysis in the most stressful situations in which they might be operative. We should be stress testing our categories and concepts and theories, not just applying them in their own comfort zones, but taking them to places where they may break down, be challenged, or will be forced to rethink them. And I think it's exactly those challenges of rethinking that we would do in these kinds of contested border zones and places of crisis and so on, where the future is being made, but not in a predictable or mechanical fashion.
Professor Jamie Peck, thank you very much for your amazing answers, and congratulations again for your Vautrin-Lud prize. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was great to talk to you.